The snowblower roared to life at exactly 6 in the morning, and I knew someone would complain, but I never thought they'd actually call 911 about it. My name is Brandon Walsh, and I'd been clearing driveways in Rockford, Illinois for the past 15 years. This particular morning started like any other mid-January day, with nearly 8 inches of fresh powder blanketing everything in sight. I'd already been up for an hour, drinking coffee and checking the weather radar while eating a quick breakfast. The forecast showed the snow had stopped around 4, which meant I needed to get started on my route before the morning commute turned everything into a slushy nightmare. My contract with the Rockford Police Department meant their parking lot was always my first stop, usually around 5:30. I'd finished there by 5:45, and now I was working on my own driveway in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision. The subdivision was one of those newer developments that had sprung up about 10 years ago, complete with vinyl-sided homes that all looked vaguely similar, and an HOA that seemed to think they ruled a small kingdom instead of managing a neighborhood. When I'd bought my house here 7 years ago, the HOA rules seemed reasonable enough. Keep your grass cut, don't paint your house neon pink, the usual stuff. But 3 years ago, Patricia Henderson had taken over as HOA president, and things had gone downhill fast. I was about halfway through my driveway, methodically pushing the snow into neat piles on the side, when I saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the white landscape. At first, I thought there might be an accident on the main road, but the squad car turned onto my street. And it was slowing down as it approached my house. I shut off the snowblower, confusion washing over me as Officer Mike Chen stepped out of his vehicle. Mike and I knew each other well, since I saw him almost every morning at the station when I plowed their lot. He had this bewildered expression on his face as he walked up my driveway, shaking his head. "Brandon," he said, and I could hear the disbelief in his voice. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'm only here because dispatch is still laughing their heads off and insisted I come document this." "Document what?" I asked, pulling off my work gloves. "Did you know that operating a snowblower at 6 in the morning is apparently an emergency worthy of calling 911? Mike pulled out his notepad, but I could see him fighting back a smile. "You're kidding me." I wish I was. "We got a call about 15 minutes ago from a Patricia Henderson, claiming that you were violating noise ordinances and creating a public disturbance. She told the dispatcher it was an emergency and demanded immediate police response." Mike looked down at his notes. "The dispatcher, Jenny, asked her if anyone was in danger or if any crime was being committed. Your neighbor insisted that yes, a crime was being committed, and that you needed to be arrested immediately for disturbing the peace." I ran my hand through my hair, bits of snow falling from my knit cap. "Let me guess, Patricia from the HOA, the very same. Jenny recognized your address and nearly dropped the phone when she realized where the complaint was about. She told me you'd literally just left the station 45 minutes ago after plowing our entire lot." Mike finally let himself grin. "The entire dispatch room got a good laugh out of it, but protocol says we have to respond to all calls, even the ridiculous ones." As if on cue, a door slammed across the street. Patricia Henderson marched toward us, wrapped in a thick purple bathrobe with her blonde hair in curlers. She was 53 years old, and I knew this because she'd mentioned it at every single HOA meeting I'd been unfortunate enough to attend. She believed this made her wise and experienced, though most of the neighborhood just found her exhausting. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Patricia called out, her voice shrill in the quiet morning air. "This man has been operating heavy machinery in a residential zone during quiet hours." According to our HOA bylaws, Section 12, subsection 4, no powered lawn or snow removal equipment may be operated before 8 a.m. on weekdays or 9 a.m. on weekends. Mike turned to face her, and I watched his professional mask slide into place. "Madam, I understand you called 911 about this situation." "Yes, I certainly did. This is an emergency. The entire neighborhood is being subjected to this terrible noise, and something needs to be done about it immediately." Patricia crossed her arms, looking triumphant. "Madam, 911 is for life-threatening emergencies only. Calling 911 for a noise complaint, especially one that doesn't violate any actual city ordinances, is considered misuse of emergency services. It's actually a crime in Illinois, punishable by a fine." Mike kept his voice level and professional. Patricia's face reddened. "I have every right to call the police when laws are being broken. HOA bylaws aren't laws, Mrs. Henderson. They're private contractual agreements between homeowners. The police don't enforce HOA rules." Mike gestured toward me. "Additionally, Mr. Walsh here is operating his snowblower at 6 a.m., which is perfectly legal according to Rockford's actual noise ordinances. The city allows snow removal equipment to be operated as early as 5 a.m., specifically because people need to clear their driveways before work. But our HOA rules clearly state," Patricia started. "Are not enforceable by law enforcement," Mike interrupted gently but firmly. "If you have an issue with HOA compliance, that's a civil matter between you and your neighbors. What you've done by calling 911 is actually a crime. I'm going to let you off with a warning this time, but if you call 911 again for a non-emergency, you will be cited and fined. Do you understand?" I watched Patricia's face cycle through several shades of red and purple. "This is outrageous. I am the HOA president, and I have a responsibility to enforce our community standards. That may be, but you don't have the right to misuse emergency services." Mike closed his notepad. "Have a good morning, Mrs. Henderson." Patricia sputtered for a moment, then turned on her heel and stomped back toward her house. As she reached her door, she shouted back, "This isn't over, Brandon Walsh. I'll be filing a formal HOA complaint and you will be fined." Mike waited until her door slammed before he started laughing. Man, Jenny was right. She said the woman sounded like she was reporting an armed robbery. Full panic mode over a snowblower. "Patricia takes the HOA very seriously," I said, shaking my head. "But she's never called the cops before. That's a new level even for her." "Well, just so you know, you're not breaking any laws. The city ordinance is clear. Between November 1st and March 31st, snow removal equipment can be operated starting at 5 a.m. You could have started an hour earlier and still been legal." Mike headed back toward his car. "I'll file a report about the misuse of 911. Hopefully, it'll discourage her from pulling this stunt again." "Thanks, Mike. Sorry you had to drive out here for this. Are you kidding? This is the most entertainment Dispatch has had all month." Jenny said she's never heard someone so insistent that a snowblower was a criminal emergency. Mike got into his car, still chuckling. "See you tomorrow morning, usual time." "I'll be there," I confirmed, watching as he drove off. I restarted the snowblower, determined to finish my driveway despite Patricia's theatrics. The machine rumbled back to life, and I completed the job in another 20 minutes. My neighbors on both sides had already left for work, their own driveways still covered in snow. I made a mental note to swing by and clear theirs later if they didn't get to it first. That was the thing about living in a neighborhood, you helped each other out, or at least you were supposed to. After finishing my driveway, I loaded the snowblower back into my truck and headed out to tackle the rest of my client list. I had 12 residential driveways contracted for the season, plus 3 small business parking lots and the police station. It kept me busy during the winter months and supplemented my main income from my landscaping business during the warmer seasons. My phone rang as I was finishing up the Martinez family's driveway. It was Tom Brennan, my next-door neighbor and one of the few people in Meadowbrook Heights who seemed to have a backbone when it came to dealing with the HOA. "Hey, Brandon, I heard Patricia called the cops on you this morning," Tom said without preamble. "News travels fast," I replied, shutting off the snowblower to hear him better. "My wife saw the whole thing from our bedroom window. She said Patricia looked like she was about to have a stroke when the officer basically told her to pound sand." Tom laughed. "Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up. Patricia just sent out an emergency HOA meeting notice. She's calling for a special session tonight at 7 to discuss your flagrant violation of community standards." "You've got to be kidding me." "I wish. The email went out about 30 minutes ago. She's demanding that the board vote on imposing a $2,000 fine and requiring you to sign a formal agreement that you won't operate any powered equipment before 8 a.m. Tom's voice carried a note of disgust. "She's also proposing that we amend the bylaws to give the HOA president authority to call law enforcement on behalf of the community for any violations." I leaned against my truck, feeling a headache building behind my eyes. That's insane. She can't actually enforce a $2,000 fine for something that isn't even illegal. You'd be surprised what HOAs can get away with if people don't push back, and most folks around here are too busy or too intimidated by Patricia to say anything. Tom sighed. "But I'll tell you what, I'm not going to sit quietly on this one. This is beyond ridiculous." "I'll be there," I said, already dreading the evening ahead. "Thanks for the warning, Tom." The rest of my morning passed in a blur of snow removal and cold wind. By the time I finished my last job around 2 in the afternoon, I was exhausted and needed a hot shower. But when I got home, I found a formal-looking letter stuck to my front door. It was from the Meadowbrook Heights HOA, printed on their official letterhead with Patricia's name emblazoned at the top. The letter informed me that I was being fined $500 for the violation this morning, with an additional $1,500 fine pending the board's vote at tonight's meeting. It also stated that I was required to attend the meeting to present my case, and failure to appear would result in additional penalties. The language was formal and threatening, full of phrases like willful disregard for community welfare and repeated pattern of non-compliance. That last bit made me angry. I'd never violated any HOA rules before this morning, and even this morning's violation was only a violation according to an HOA bylaw that conflicted with actual city law. I'd been a model resident, keeping my property maintained, paying my HOA dues on time, and even volunteering for neighborhood events. But Patricia had decided I was her target, and apparently she was going all in. I spent the afternoon researching Illinois HOA law and Rockford's specific ordinances. What I found was both encouraging and frustrating. While HOAs could enforce their bylaws, they couldn't enforce rules that conflicted with municipal, state, or federal law. The city's noise ordinance clearly permitted snow removal equipment starting at 5 a.m. during winter months. That meant the HOA's 8 a.m. rule was unenforceable, at least when it came to snow removal. However, the legal remedy for fighting an HOA was typically civil court, which meant lawyers and money and time. Patricia was probably counting on most people being unwilling to go through that hassle over a snow removal schedule, but she'd miscalculated with me. I wasn't just some random homeowner. I had connections with the police department through my plowing contract, and I'd been in business long enough to know my rights. I also called my insurance agent, Martha Reynolds, who handled both my business and homeowner policies. She'd been in the insurance game for 30 years and had seen her share of HOA disputes. "Brandon, honey, this Patricia woman sounds like a piece of work," Martha said after I explained the situation. "But here's the thing. If she pushes this fine through and you refuse to pay, they can put a lien on your house. Now, that lien is only enforceable if you sell or refinance, but it's still a pain in the rear." "So what do?" I asked. "You fight it, but you document everything." "Attend that meeting tonight, state your case clearly, and make sure someone is taking official minutes. Get a copy of those minutes. If they vote to fine you, despite the fact that you weren't breaking any actual laws, you send them a formal letter citing the city ordinance and stating that you won't pay the fine. Then they'll have to decide if they want to take you to civil court to enforce it, which they probably won't because they'll lose. And if they do take me to court, then you counterclaim for harassment and legal fees. Any judge will see that their bylaw conflicts with city code and rule in your favor. Plus, you might want to mention at tonight's meeting that you're prepared to take this to court if necessary. Sometimes that's enough to make people back down." Martha paused. "Oh, and Brandon, record the meeting if you can. Illinois is a two-party consent state, so you need to announce that you're recording, but do it. These things have a way of people denying what was said later." I thanked Martha for the advice and spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the meeting. I printed out copies of the relevant city ordinances, pulled up the contract I had with the police department showing that I was required to plow their lot early in the morning, and even drafted a brief statement to present to the board. At 6:30, I grabbed my folder of documents and headed to the community center where HOA meetings were held. The Meadowbrook Heights Community Center was a small building at the entrance to our subdivision, featuring a meeting room, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. It was maintained through HOA dues and was actually one of the few useful things our fees paid for. When I arrived, the parking lot was already half full. Apparently, word of the drama had spread, and people wanted to see the show. I recognized most of the cars belonging to my neighbors. Tom's pickup was there, along with vehicles I recognized as belonging to the Johnsons, the Patel family, and at least a dozen other residents. Inside, the meeting room was set up with rows of folding chairs facing a long table at the front where the HOA board sat. Patricia was already in her seat at the center, flanked by the other board members. Roger Klein, the vice president, Susan Carmichael, the secretary, David Hoffman, the treasurer, and Carol Morrison, the member at large. Patricia looked up as I entered, and her expression was pure vindication. "Mr. Walsh, how good of you to join us. Please take a seat." I sat in the front row, and Tom immediately moved to sit beside me. Several other neighbors gave me supportive nods as they found their own seats. By 7, the room was packed with at least 40 residents, which was unusual. Most monthly meetings drew maybe 10 people if we were lucky. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. "Thank you all for attending this emergency session. As you know from my email this morning, we have a serious matter to address. This morning at approximately 6 a.m., Mr. Brandon Walsh flagrantly violated our community bylaws by operating a gasoline-powered snowblower during restricted quiet hours." "I wasn't breaking any laws," I interjected. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "You will have a chance to speak, Mr. Walsh." "Please do not interrupt," she continued. "This violation represents a pattern of disregard for our community standards. Mr. Walsh clearly believes that his convenience is more important than the peace and comfort of his neighbors." Tom raised his hand. Patricia, I'm going to have to stop you right there. What pattern? Brandon has never violated any HOA rules before. The pattern is his attitude, Patricia shot back. He has consistently shown that he doesn't respect the authority of this board. That's completely false, I said, standing up. I've never violated any rules before, and I didn't violate any laws this morning either. The city ordinance clearly states that snow removal equipment can be operated starting at 5 a.m. between November and March. I have a copy of that ordinance right here. I held up the printed document. Roger, the vice president, spoke up. He was a retired accountant who usually went along with whatever Patricia wanted. The city ordinance may say that, but our HOA bylaws are more restrictive. We have the right to set our own community standards. Actually, you don't, I replied, keeping my voice calm. HOA bylaws cannot supersede municipal ordinances. If there's a conflict, the city law takes precedence. I've spoken with my attorney about this. I hadn't actually spoken with an attorney yet, but they didn't need to know that. Susan, the secretary, a nervous woman in her 40s, glanced at Patricia before speaking. But don't residents agree to follow all HOA rules when they purchase their homes? Yes, but those rules have to be legal and enforceable, Tom interjected, standing up beside me. You can't enforce a rule that contradicts actual law. If the city says snow removal equipment can run at 5 a.m., then that's the legal standard. The HOA can't overrule that. Patricia's face was getting red again. This is exactly the kind of argumentative behavior I'm talking about. The purpose of an HOA is to maintain standards that might not be covered by city ordinances. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's appropriate for our community. So you're saying the HOA should ban things that are perfectly legal? Someone called out from the back of the room. I turned to see Angela Morrison, Carol's daughter, standing with her arms crossed. Where does that end? Can you ban people from parking in their own driveways if you don't like the color of their car? That's not what I'm saying, Patricia snapped. I'm saying that we have rules for a reason, and those rules need to be enforced, even when those rules are wrong. Another voice chimed in. This was Raj Patel, who lived 3 houses down from me. I work nights at the hospital. I get home around 6 a.m. If someone is already out clearing snow by then, that's actually helpful because it means the streets are safer when I'm driving home exhausted from a 12-hour shift. Patricia looked around the room, clearly not expecting this level of pushback. The board has already made its decision. We're here tonight to vote on the fine amount and to hear from Mr. Walsh before we proceed with enforcement. Before you vote on anything, I'd like to make a formal statement, I said, picking up my folder. And I'd like to record this meeting for my records. Is anyone opposed to being recorded? Patricia's jaw clenched. I don't think that's necessary. Illinois is a 2-party consent state, Tom said. Brandon has the right to ask, and if everyone consents, he can record. Anyone who objects can leave the room. I pulled out my phone and set it on the chair beside me, hitting record. I'll take silence as consent. For the record, this is the Meadowbrook Heights HOA emergency meeting on January 16, 2025, regarding the complaint filed against Brandon Walsh. Patricia looked like she wanted to object, but she couldn't figure out a good reason to. Instead, she gestured impatiently. Fine. Make your statement, Mr. Walsh. I took a breath and began. This morning at 6 a.m., I was clearing my own driveway with my snowblower. I've been doing snow removal professionally for 15 years. Every morning during winter, I start by plowing the parking lot at the Rockford Police Station, which I'm contracted to maintain. I finish there by 5:45 a.m., and then I clear my own property before moving on to my other clients. I held up the police contract. This is my contract with the Rockford Police Department, It requires me to have their lot cleared before the morning shift change at 6:30 a.m. In order to meet that obligation, I have to start work by 5:30 at the latest. This is my job, not a hobby. David, the treasurer, looked interested. You plow the police station parking lot. Every morning after it snows, yes, I've been doing it for 8 years. I set down that document and picked up the city ordinance. More importantly, Rockford's noise ordinance, section 21-43, explicitly allows snow removal equipment to operate starting at 5 a.m. between November 1st and March 31st. I was operating my equipment at 6 a.m., which is a full hour after I was legally permitted to start. I broke no laws. But you broke HOA rules, Patricia insisted. HOA rules that conflict with city ordinances aren't enforceable, I repeated. If this board chooses to fine me for following the law, I'll have no choice but to take this matter to civil court. And I'll win, because no judge will uphold an HOA fine for activity that's explicitly permitted by municipal code. Furthermore, I'll countersue for harassment and seek to recover all legal fees. The room had gone very quiet. Several board members were looking uncomfortable, especially David and Susan. Carol, the member at large, was a retired lawyer, and she'd been frowning throughout the entire exchange. Carol finally spoke up. Patricia, I think we need to table this vote and review the legal implications. Brandon makes a valid point about the conflict between our bylaws and city code. We are not tabling this, Patricia said firmly. The violation occurred, and we need to send a message that rules matter. Rules do matter, Carol agreed. Which is why we can't enforce rules that contradict the law. That's basic legal principle. If we vote to fine Brandon and he takes us to court, the HOA will lose. We'll be on the hook for his legal fees, plus our own attorney costs, plus the optics of trying to punish someone for legally clearing snow. It's a PR nightmare waiting to happen. I agree with Carol, Tom said, standing again. As a resident and dues-paying member of this HOA, I'm formally requesting that the board postpone any vote until we can get an opinion from the HOA's attorney about whether this bylaw is even enforceable. Several other residents voiced their agreement. Patricia looked around the room, her expression growing more frustrated by the second. Fine. We'll postpone the vote for 1 week. In the meantime, Mr. Walsh, I expect you to refrain from operating your snowblower before 8 a.m. I can't agree to that, I said calmly. I have contractual obligations to my clients, including the police department. I'll continue to operate my equipment in accordance with city ordinances, which means starting no earlier than 5 a.m. If that's a problem for you, take it up with the city council. Patricia stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over. This meeting is adjourned. The board will reconvene in 1 week to vote on this matter. As people started filing out, several neighbors stopped to shake my hand or offer words of support. Raj clapped me on the shoulder. About time someone stood up to her. She's been pushing people around for years. Angela, Carol's daughter, approached with her mother. Carol extended her hand. Brandon, I owe you an apology. I should have spoken up sooner about the legal issues here. Patricia has been running roughshod over this board, and I've been letting it happen because I didn't want the drama, but this has gone too far. I appreciate that, I said, shaking her hand. I'm going to call the HOA attorney tomorrow morning, Carol continued. Between you and me, I think Patricia knows this fine won't hold up. She's just trying to bully you into compliance, but she picked the wrong person to mess with. Tom and I walked out together, and he invited me over for a beer. I accepted, grateful for the distraction. His wife, Linda, had already opened a bottle of wine for herself when we arrived, and she immediately launched into her own commentary about the meeting. Patricia Henderson is absolutely insufferable, Linda said, pouring herself a generous glass. She acts like being HOA president makes her the queen of the neighborhood. I'm so glad you stood your ground, Brandon. We spent the next hour rehashing the meeting and discussing strategy. Tom suggested that I reach out to some of the other residents who seemed supportive and get them organized for the next meeting. If Patricia was going to keep pushing this, we needed to be ready to push back harder. Over the next week, things escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. The morning after the meeting, I woke up to find my snowblower vandalized. Someone had poured sugar in the gas tank and slashed the fuel line. I had to spend the entire morning at the repair shop getting it fixed, which cost me nearly $600 and caused me to miss several of my scheduled jobs. I filed a police report, though I had no proof of who'd done it. Mike Chen was the responding officer again, and he took detailed photos and statements. When I mentioned the HOA situation, his expression darkened. "You think Patricia did this?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted, "but the timing is suspicious. She was pretty angry after that meeting." "We'll patrol your street more frequently," Mike promised. "And we'll keep an eye on her property too. If she is behind this, maybe seeing a squad car roll by regularly will make her think twice about trying anything else." I had to rent a snowblower for the next 3 days while mine was being repaired, which ate further into my profits for the week. But I refused to back down. Every morning, I showed up at the police station at 5:30 and cleared their lot. Then I came home and cleared my own driveway at 6 a.m., exactly as I'd been doing all season. Patricia must have heard me because on the third morning, she came storming out of her house while I was working. This time, she had her phone out and was recording me. "I'm documenting this violation," she announced loudly over the noise of the snowblower. "This is the third time this week you've deliberately broken HOA rules." I shut off the machine. "I'm not breaking any rules, Patricia. I'm following city ordinances. This is harassment." "Harassment? You're the one waking up the entire neighborhood with your noise pollution," she shouted. "I'm going to make sure you pay for every single violation. That's 3 fines now, $1,500 each. You owe the HOA $4,500. "I'm not paying any fines for legal activity," I replied. "And if you keep this up, I'm going to file a restraining order for harassment." "You can't do that," Patricia sputtered. "Actually, I can. You've already misused 911 to file a false police report about me. You're now harassing me on my own property while I'm engaging in legal activity. That's textbook harassment." I pulled out my own phone. "And I'm documenting this conversation too, for my records." Patricia's face went through several color changes before she turned and marched back into her house, slamming the door hard enough that I heard the sound from 30 feet away. That afternoon, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. My stomach sank as I signed for it, expecting another round of threats and fines. But when I opened it, I was surprised to see that it wasn't what I'd anticipated at all. The letter was from Harrison and Associates, the law firm that represented the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. It stated that upon review of the relevant city ordinances and Illinois HOA law, the firm had advised the board that the 8 a.m. noise restriction could not be enforced for snow removal activities during the permitted hours established by municipal code. The letter went on to say that all fines levied against me were being withdrawn, and the HOA would be revising its bylaws to align with city ordinances. Furthermore, the letter stated that Patricia Henderson had been removed from her position as HOA president effective immediately, pending an investigation into potential misconduct. The board had appointed Carol Morrison as interim president. I read the letter 3 times, hardly believing what I was seeing. Then my phone rang. It was Carol. "Brandon, I wanted to call you personally to apologize," Carol said without preamble. "After the meeting last week, I contacted our attorney like I promised." When I explained the situation, he was appalled. He asked to see all the correspondence between Patricia and you, including the fine letters she sent. "Okay," I said slowly. What I didn't know, and what Patricia apparently didn't tell anyone, is that she never got board approval for any of those fines. She just issued them on her own authority. That's not how it works. Any fine over $100 requires a board vote. Carol sighed heavily. The attorney also looked into the vandalism report you filed. He advised us that the HOA could be held liable if it turns out board members were involved in illegal activity against residents. That got everyone's attention fast. "So, what happens now?" I asked. The board held an emergency session this afternoon. We voted unanimously to remove Patricia as president and to launch an investigation. We've also asked the police to look into whether she might have been involved in vandalizing your equipment. Carol paused. "I know this has been a nightmare for you, and I'm truly sorry. Patricia had been getting more and more difficult to work with, but none of us realized how far off the rails she'd gone. 2 days later, I got a call from Mike Chen asking me to come down to the station. When I arrived, he led me back to a small conference room where Detective Sarah Kim was waiting. "Brandon, thanks for coming in," Detective Kim said, gesturing for me to sit. "We've been investigating the vandalism to your snowblower, and we've made some progress. We pulled security camera footage from your neighbor's Ring doorbell across the street." She turned her laptop toward me, showing grainy night vision footage. The timestamp showed 2 a.m. on the morning my snowblower was vandalized. In the footage, a figure approached my truck, looked around furtively, and then spent several minutes doing something near the equipment before hurrying away. "The footage isn't great, but we enhanced it as much as possible," Detective Kim said, clicking to a zoomed-in still image. "Can you identify this person?" I leaned forward, studying the image. The person was wearing a dark coat and hat, but something about the build and the way they moved was familiar. Then I saw it, a distinctive purple scarf wrapped around the person's neck. The same purple scarf Patricia wore constantly during winter. She'd even been wearing it at the HOA meeting. "That's Patricia Henderson," I said, feeling my anger rising. "She has a scarf exactly like that. She wears it all the time." Detective Kim nodded. "We thought so too." We've also pulled her phone records, and there are several text messages between her and Roger Klein, the former vice president, discussing teaching you a lesson and making you sorry you challenged the board. "Are you serious?" I asked, stunned. "Very serious." We've applied for a warrant to search her property for the clothing seen in the footage and to examine her phone directly. Detective Kim closed her laptop. "Brandon, I want to be clear about what we're looking at here. If we can prove Patricia vandalized your property, that's criminal damage to property. Given the cost of the repairs, it's a misdemeanor, punishable by up to a year in jail and fines up to $2,500. "I just want her to stop harassing me," I said. "I understand, and that's your choice whether to press charges if we make an arrest. But even if you don't, the state can still prosecute if we have sufficient evidence." Detective Kim's expression was serious. "What concerns me more is the pattern of behavior. The misuse of 911, the harassment, the vandalism, and the abuse of her HOA position. This isn't just a dispute between neighbors. This is someone who thinks they are above the law." The warrant was executed 2 days later. I wasn't there, but Tom called me immediately afterward to tell me that police had spent 3 hours at Patricia's house, emerging with several bags of evidence. By that evening, Patricia Henderson had been arrested and charged with criminal damage to property. The story hit the local news the next day. Rockford isn't a huge city, and a story about an HOA president vandalizing a resident's snow removal equipment over a noise dispute was too good for the media to pass up. The headline in the Rockford Register-Star read, "HOA president arrested for vandalizing snow plow over 6 a.m. start time." My phone rang constantly with reporters wanting interviews, but I declined most of them. I did speak with one journalist from the paper, mainly to set the record straight about the facts of the case. I wanted people to understand that I'd been following the law the entire time, and that Patricia had been the one acting illegally. The article that ran was fair and thorough. It detailed the timeline of events, included quotes from the police about the investigation, and even mentioned that I held the contract to plow the police station parking lot. That detail seemed to particularly resonate with readers. The comments section of the online article was overwhelmingly supportive, with many people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Roger Klein, the former vice president who'd been implicated in the text messages, resigned from the HOA board immediately after Patricia's arrest. Susan Carmichael, the secretary, also resigned, saying she couldn't in good conscience continue serving after what had happened. David Hoffman stayed on as treasurer, but he issued a public apology to me and to the community for not speaking up sooner about Patricia's behavior. Carol Morrison, now the permanent HOA president after a community vote, reached out to me several times during this period. She was genuinely remorseful about the whole situation and wanted to make things right. Under her leadership, the board voted to reimburse me for the repair costs to my snowblower, the rental equipment I'd needed, and even the legal consultation fees I'd incurred. More importantly, Carol proposed a complete overhaul of the HOA bylaws. She scheduled a series of community meetings where residents could provide input on what rules made sense and what rules were overly restrictive or outdated. The turnout for these meetings was unprecedented. People who'd never attended an HOA meeting before showed up to voice their opinions. The revised bylaws that eventually emerged were much more reasonable. The noise restrictions were updated to align with city ordinances. The fine structure was overhauled to require full board votes for any fine over $50, and residents were given a clear appeals process. Most importantly, the bylaws now explicitly stated that HOA rules could not contradict or supersede federal, state, or municipal laws. Patricia's criminal case moved slowly through the court system, as these things do. Her attorney tried to get the charges reduced or dismissed, arguing that it was a civil dispute between neighbors that had been improperly criminalized. But the prosecutor's office wasn't having it. They had clear video evidence, text messages showing premeditation, and a defendant who'd already demonstrated a pattern of misusing emergency services and abusing her position of authority. In early April, Patricia accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to criminal damage to property and misuse of 911. She was sentenced to 6 months in jail, suspended pending completion of 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and restitution of $600 to cover my repair costs, even though the HOA had already reimbursed me. The judge also ordered her to undergo anger management counseling and banned her from serving in any HOA leadership position for 5 years. At the sentencing hearing, which I attended, the judge had some pointed words for Patricia. "Mrs. Henderson, you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that trust in multiple ways. You misused emergency services, which could have prevented first responders from reaching someone with a real emergency. You vandalized your neighbor's property out of spite and a misguided sense of authority, and you attempted to use a community organization as a weapon against someone who was simply trying to do their job. This behavior is not just inappropriate, it's criminal, and it won't be tolerated. Patricia stood there stone-faced as the judge spoke, but I saw her hands trembling. Her husband, a quiet man named George whom I'd rarely seen around the neighborhood, looked mortified. After the sentencing, he approached me in the courthouse hallway. "Mr. Walsh, I want to apologize for my wife's behavior," George said quietly. "I didn't know what she was doing. If I had, I would have stopped her. She's been difficult lately. I think the power of being HOA president went to her head." "I appreciate that," I said, not quite sure how else to respond. "We're moving," George continued. "I can't stay in that neighborhood after all this. It's too embarrassing. We've already put the house on the market." He shook his head sadly. 30 years of marriage, and I feel like I don't even know who she is anymore. I felt a twinge of sympathy for him, despite everything. He seemed like a decent man who'd been caught up in his wife's crusade. Life in Meadowbrook Heights gradually returned to normal, though it was a different kind of normal than before. The community was more engaged now. HOA meetings regularly drew 20 or 30 residents instead of the usual handful. People paid attention to what the board was doing and weren't afraid to speak up when they disagreed with something. Carol proved to be an excellent president. She was organized, fair, and actually interested in serving the community rather than ruling over it. Under her leadership, the HOA started a neighborhood watch program, organized several community events, and even negotiated a better contract for landscaping services that saved everyone money on their dues. As for me, I continued doing what I'd always done. Every morning after a snowfall, I showed up at the police station at 5:30 and cleared their lot. Then I went home and cleared my own driveway, usually around 6 a.m. Nobody called the cops about it anymore. In fact, several neighbors started asking me to add them to my client list. Business was good. Mike Chen and I became better friends through the whole ordeal. He started referring other commercial clients to me, and my business expanded beyond just residential driveways. By the next winter, I had contracts with 2 more police stations in neighboring towns, plus a fire station and 3 municipal buildings. The story of Patricia's arrest and the HOA dispute became something of a local legend. I couldn't go to the hardware store or grab coffee at the diner without someone mentioning it. Most people thought it was hilarious that an HOA president had called 911 over a snowblower at 6 a.m. and ended up getting arrested herself. A few saw it as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and the importance of standing up for your rights. Tom and Linda became 2 of my closest friends. We had dinner together regularly, and Tom joined me for my weekly poker game with some of the other local business owners. He loved telling the story of Patricia storming out in her bathrobe to yell at the cop, and it never failed to get laughs. Jenny, the 911 dispatcher who'd taken Patricia's original call, actually reached out to me through Mike Chen. She wanted to apologize for laughing during the call, even though I told her there was nothing to apologize for. We ended up getting coffee, and she explained that in 10 years of dispatch work, she'd never had someone call 911 about a snowblower. The way she was describing it, I thought someone was running a jackhammer inside someone's bedroom, Jenny told me, shaking her head. When she gave your address, and I realized you were the guy who plows our station lot every morning, I just lost it. The whole dispatch room was cracking up. It was absurd. "Well, I'm glad I could provide some entertainment," I said, laughing myself now that the whole ordeal was behind me. The following winter, we had an unusually harsh February storm that dumped nearly 2 feet of snow overnight. I was out at 3 a.m. clearing the police station so they could manage the emergency response needs. By the time I got home at 6, my own street was still completely buried. I fired up my snowblower and got to work. As I was clearing my driveway, several neighbors emerged from their houses. Instead of complaining about the noise, they thanked me. Raj Patel, heading home from his night shift at the hospital, stopped his car to wave and shout his appreciation for clearing the street entrance. The Johnsons, an elderly couple next door, came out to tell me they were grateful someone was already working on snow removal because they'd been worried about getting out for a doctor's appointment later that morning. It was a far cry from the morning a year earlier, when Patricia had called 911 in outrage. As I finished up my driveway and moved on to help some of my neighbors with theirs, I thought about how much had changed. An HOA dispute that could have ended with me being bullied into submission or facing illegal fines had instead exposed corruption, resulted in necessary reforms, and ultimately made the community stronger. Patricia's house sold in May to a young family with 2 kids. They seemed nice enough, though understandably nervous about moving into a house with such recent notoriety. I made a point to introduce myself and welcome them to the neighborhood. The husband, whose name was Jason, asked me directly about the whole HOA situation. "I heard about what happened with the previous owner," Jason said carefully. "Is the HOA going to be a problem?" "Not anymore," I assured him. "We've got good leadership now, and the bylaws have been completely overhauled. As long as you're not vandalizing equipment or calling 911 about legal activities, you'll be fine." Jason laughed, though there was still some nervousness in it. "That's good to know. We were worried we'd bought into a nightmare HOA situation." "It was a nightmare for a while," I admitted. "But sometimes things have to get really bad before people are willing to make changes. The HOA is actually functional now. Carol runs things fairly. The rules make sense, and people actually participate instead of letting one person have all the power." Over the next few months, I watched Jason and his family settle in. Their kids, both under 10, were friendly and polite. Jason himself turned out to be a lawyer who worked for a non-profit legal aid organization. When he heard the full story of what had happened with Patricia, he was both appalled and fascinated. "You know, HOA disputes are one of the most common civil legal issues people face," Jason told me one evening when we were both out watering our lawns. "And most people don't know their rights. They just assume the HOA can do whatever it wants because it's in the bylaws. But that's not true. HOAs are bound by the same laws as everyone else." "I learned that the hard way," I said. "You did more than that. You stood up for yourself, and in doing so, you probably helped every resident in this neighborhood. Most people would have just paid the fine to avoid the hassle." Jason gestured around the subdivision. This could have been a neighborhood where the HOA terrorized residents into compliance with increasingly ridiculous rules. Instead, it's a place where people know they have rights, and the HOA serves the community instead of ruling it. His words stuck with me. I'd never thought of myself as some kind of neighborhood hero. I'd just been trying to do my job and not let someone push me around. But Jason was right that the outcome had been bigger than just my personal situation. The entire HOA structure had been reformed. Multiple people in positions of authority had been held accountable for their actions, and the community was genuinely better for it. That summer, Carol organized a neighborhood block party, the first one Meadowbrook Heights had ever had. It was held at the community center on a perfect Saturday afternoon in June. There were grills set up, kids running around, and neighbors actually talking to each other instead of just waving as they drove by. Carol pulled me aside at one point during the party. "I want to thank you again, Brandon. I know the whole thing with Patricia was stressful and costly for you, but your willingness to stand your ground changed this neighborhood for the better." "I was just defending my right to clear snow," I said, feeling a bit embarrassed by the praise. "You were defending everyone's rights," Carol corrected. "Patricia was out of control and she would have kept getting worse if someone hadn't finally said enough. The HOA was becoming toxic, and residents were talking about dissolving it entirely. Now we've got participation, engagement, and actual community. That matters." As the party continued, I found myself talking with neighbors I'd barely spoken to before. People thanked me, shared their own stories of dealing with Patricia's increasingly bizarre demands over the years, and expressed relief that things had changed. Several people admitted they'd been thinking about moving because of the HOA situation, but had decided to stay after seeing the reforms that were implemented. The local newspaper did a follow-up story that summer, 1 year after Patricia's arrest. The article focused on the transformation of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA from a source of neighborhood tension to a model of community engagement. They interviewed Carol, several residents, and me. The headline read, "How a Snowblower Dispute Reformed a Neighborhood." Reading that article, I was struck by how something so simple had snowballed, no pun intended, into such a significant situation. A snowblower running at 6 a.m. That was all it had been. But Patricia's overreaction, her abuse of power, and her willingness to break the law to get her way had exposed deeper problems that needed to be addressed. The article quoted a professor from the University of Illinois who specialized in property law and HOA governance. She talked about how HOAs across the country were increasingly becoming sources of conflict, often because board members didn't understand the legal limitations on their authority, or because power-hungry individuals used HOA positions to bully neighbors. "What makes the Meadowbrook Heights case interesting," the professor said in the article, "is that it represents both the problem and the solution. You had a clear case of HOA overreach and abuse of power. But you also had a resident who knew his rights and was willing to fight back, combined with other board members who ultimately chose to do the right thing. That combination is what led to meaningful reform." As fall approached, and I started preparing my equipment for another winter season, I felt a sense of satisfaction about how things had turned out. My business was thriving. I had good relationships with my neighbors, and the HOA was actually functioning the way it was supposed to. Patricia was completing her community service, and according to what I'd heard, was in counseling and trying to rebuild her life. Her marriage had survived, though George had apparently insisted on moving to a different part of the city where they could start fresh. The first significant snowfall of the new season came in mid-November. I was up at 5, drinking coffee and checking the radar just like always. By 5:30, I was at the police station, clearing their lot. By 6, I was home, firing up my snowblower to tackle my driveway. The sound of the engine echoed through the quiet morning air. Not a single neighbor complained. Not a single 911 call was made. It was just another winter morning in Rockford, Illinois, with snow that needed to be cleared and work that needed to be done. As I methodically pushed the snow into neat piles, watching the sky gradually lighten from black to deep blue to pale gray, I thought about how far things had come. A year ago, this simple act of clearing snow had triggered a chain of events that included police reports, HOA meetings, investigations, and criminal charges. Now it was just normal, the way it should have always been. When I finished my driveway, I moved on to help my elderly neighbors without being asked. Then, I cleared the driveway of a single mom down the street who worked early shifts at the hospital. By the time I left for my other contracted jobs, half the driveways on my street were clear, and the sun was finally coming up over the horizon. That evening, I got a text from Tom. Another peaceful morning of illegal snowblowing at 6 a.m. When will your reign of terror end? I laughed and texted back. Never. I'm a menace to society. The most polite menace I've ever met, he replied. Beer later, absolutely. Sitting in Tom's garage that evening, drinking beer and listening to him recount some story about his day at work, I felt genuinely content. Life in Meadowbrook Heights had returned to normal, but it was a better normal than before. People looked out for each other. The HOA served its actual purpose instead of being a tool for petty tyranny. And I could clear snow whenever I needed to without worrying about police showing up or facing illegal fines. The whole ordeal had taught me something important. Standing up for yourself matters, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. If I just paid that first fine to avoid conflict, Patricia would have kept pushing. The HOA would have kept overreaching. Other residents would have continued being bullied into compliance with increasingly ridiculous demands. By refusing to back down, by knowing my rights and defending them, I'd accidentally sparked a change that benefited everyone. Of course, I'd never set out to be some kind of neighborhood reformer. I just wanted to clear my driveway and do my job. But sometimes that's how change happens. Someone stands up in a small way over a small thing, and it becomes a catalyst for something larger. Years later, people in Rockford still sometimes brought up the story. It became one of those local legends that gets told and retold, usually getting slightly exaggerated with each telling. In some versions, Patricia had tried to physically attack me. In others, the police had dragged her away in handcuffs while she screamed about HOA bylaws. The truth was more mundane, but in some ways more interesting because it showed how ordinary situations can escalate when reasonable people fail to act, and unreasonable people gain power. As for me, I kept plowing snow, maintaining lawns, and living my life in Meadowbrook Heights. My contract with the police department expanded to include snow removal at several other municipal buildings. My business grew steadily. And every winter morning after a snowfall, I'd fire up my snowblower at 6 a.m. and clear my driveway, secure in the knowledge that I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing, exactly when I was supposed to be doing it. The community center had my story framed on the wall eventually, the newspaper article about the HOA reform. Carol had insisted on putting it up as a reminder of why community engagement mattered, and why leadership needed to serve residents rather than rule over them. I'd been embarrassed when she first suggested it, but eventually, I came to appreciate the sentiment. It wasn't about celebrating me personally. It was about celebrating the principle that ordinary people could stand up against unfair treatment and create positive change. And every time a new resident moved into Meadowbrook Heights and attended their first HOA meeting, someone would inevitably point to that framed article and tell them the story of how a snowblower running at 6 a.m. had changed everything. The story became part of the neighborhood's identity, a shared history that reminded everyone that communities work best when people participate, when leaders serve rather than dictate, and when residents aren't afraid to stand up for what's right. Looking back on everything that had happened, from that first 911 call to Patricia's arrest to the HOA reforms to the community we'd built, I realized that some of the best outcomes come from the most unlikely circumstances. I never would have chosen to go through that ordeal, but I also couldn't deny that something good had come from it. Meadowbrook Heights was a better place to live. The HOA was a better organization. And I'd learned that sometimes the simplest acts, like clearing snow early in the morning so you can get to work on time, are worth defending, no matter how much trouble it causes. The snowblower that had started it all, the one Patricia had vandalized, was still running strong. I'd had it repaired, and it worked just as well as ever. Sometimes when I fired it up on cold winter mornings, I'd think about that morning when Patricia had called 911, when the dispatcher had laughed because I plowed for the police station, when Officer Mike Chen had shown up at my door with that bewildered expression on his face. It had been absurd and stressful and ultimately criminal, but it had also been the catalyst for change that the neighborhood desperately needed. And for that, I was grateful, even for the parts that had been difficult. Because at the end of the day, Meadowbrook Heights wasn't just a subdivision with an HOA anymore. It was a real community, where neighbors helped each other, where leadership served the people, and where someone could clear snow at 6 in the morning without fear of harassment, illegal fines, or having the police called on them for doing their job. And that was worth fighting for.